Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Rafael. So I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning, and thank you all for joining the call. I hope you can all hear me well. Well, as you know, Europe is now the epicenter for the greatest health crisis in living memory. Governments have taken extraordinary measures to slow down the spread of COVID-19. This has involved, obviously, a widespread travel bans. As a result, air travel across Europe has almost completely stopped. The latest network figures show air travel down nearly 80% or more compared to the same period last years ago. And we have seen some airlines that have cut service by over 90% as well. The almost complete shutdown of the industry has caused an unprecedented crisis for the airlines. The latest estimate is for global revenues to be down by $252 billion compared to last year. Now, these figures for Europe, that we have calculated, that the revenues will actually go down by $76 billion compared to the same period last year. And then at the same time, we are expecting a 46% reduction on revenue passenger kilometer compared to 2019. This collapse in revenues is causing, as you can imagine, a liquidity crisis for the carriers. Estimates from IATA's economics team are that on average, European airlines had about 2 months reserves at the start of the crisis. So this cash will be burning up fast. And remember, that is actually an average. Many airlines will have much less than that. So to preserve cash, airlines have parked aircraft and laid off workers, but these measures will not be sufficient. The time has come for governments to give direct financial support to the industry. Now, you will ask why airlines should be at the front of the queue for support. Well, there are several answers to that question. Firstly, the air travel industry is an employment machine. In Europe, airlines directly employ more than 500,000 people. That goes up to 2.6 million when all other industry jobs like airports, ANSPs, and manufacturers are added. And it goes up to 7.1 million when all the induced and indirect employment is added. And it goes up to 12.2 million when all the employment from tourism and travel by air are included as well. So in fact, we estimate that for every job supported by an airline, 24 jobs are created somewhere else in the economy, thanks to air transport. All these jobs are at risk from the collapse of the industry. So secondly, airlines and their passengers generate significant tax returns for governments. Worldwide, the industry gave governments $129 billion in taxes last year. I don't have the breakdown for Europe, but if we take the UK air passenger duty alone, brought in more than £7 billion last year. It is clear that governments need a healthy aviation industry to help pay for schools, hospitals, police, and all other expenses of civilization. And thirdly, the most important of all, aviation is a catalyst for the wider economy. Aviation supports $823 billion of GDP across Europe. It transports a third of world trade by value, and 1/2 of all tourists travel by air. In summary, the air transport industry is crucial, and government support is needed to A, keep airlines alive during the second lockdown, preserving jobs, keeping essential connections, open to repatriate citizens, and bringing in vital air cargo supply. And B, allow airlines to rapidly scale up operations as soon as travel restrictions are lifted to jumpstart the economy again. This second point is absolutely crucial. If an airline dies, it cannot be quickly restarted. It needs new planes and new crew. It needs to restart its ticketing and marketing operations. It needs to pass all the safety inspections. It needs to recapitalize, etc., etc. All of that would create needless delays in getting the economy moving. Every day the recession is unnecessarily prolonged means more job losses and less tax revenues for public services. In short, aid to airlines now means a stronger, faster recovery from this crisis. What form of relief are we asking for? Fortunately, a number of governments have already stepped up, and we'd like to thank them for their actions, actually. And some of these examples include, like Norway has a package of 6 billion Norwegian kroner to aid for airlines. Sweden, 1.5 billion Swedish kroner for loan guarantees, and similarly Denmark, 1.5 billion Denmark kroner for Danish kroner for loan guarantees. Then Finland has 600 million euros in support for the airline industry. France has granted 700 million euros in tax relief, and Italy 500 million in direct cash injection. These measures are all most welcome, and we are grateful. However, it is unlikely that this will be enough. Some 200 billion is probably needed worldwide to support the industry. We need a mixture of direct financial support, loans guarantee, and support for the corporate bond market, as well as tax relief. In general, we're asking other stakeholders to show flexibility where they can. And we have written to the ministers of transport to ask for waivers, for example, on aircraft parking fees, as the majority of the fleet is grounded. In addition to direct financial aid, regulatory support is vital. Here, the European Union plays a crucial role. We have called for a number of rapid actions with mixed success. On slots, we are grateful to the European Council for insisting on a full season waiver to the slot use rule. This will enable airlines and airports greater flexibility for this season and greater certainty for the summer. On the EU 261 passenger rights rule, the Commission's guidance was not helpful. Carriers are facing a cash flow apocalypse. Issuing vouchers instead of immediate refunds is a necessary response to an unprecedented situation. So far, this is only allowed in some countries for tour operators selling packages, but not for airlines selling tickets. The EU 261 regulation was never imagined to have to operate in such an extreme circumstances. Short-term flexibility is needed urgently by a temporary amendment of the EU 261, something that was done already for slot. And longer term, it is clear that the regulation will need complete reform. As a good example, Turkey was able to move faster to instigate a more flexible passenger rights regime. Finally, a word on air cargo. It is doing vital work bringing in supplies. Regulatory help is crucial here to fast-track procedures for overflight and landing permits, accepting flight crews members who do not interact with the public for a 14-day quarantine, removing economic impediments such as overflight charges, parking fees, and slot restrictions. So to conclude, the industry is in an unprecedented crisis. We know that the economic crisis is impacting on many businesses now, but we believe support for keeping airlines going is essential so that we can get through this emergency and play a massive role in boosting the recovery. And now I'm actually happy to take any questions.
Super. Thank you very much, Rafael. So, as I said, please submit your questions through the text function, and we will begin with the first question, which is so we have a question on what IATA think of airlines that are future tickets for overly cheap prices. Is that not sending the wrong message of business as usual?
Sorry, Chris, you were cut off a bit, so I couldn't hear well, actually.
I understand. I've also copied the question to your text box, Rafael, so you may be able to see that, but I'll repeat. So what does IATA think of airlines that are selling future tickets for cheap prices? Is that not sending the wrong message? Business as usual?
Well, I think airlines, this is, as I said before, an unprecedented crisis. I mean, airlines are, making plans to restart in the future. Obviously, there is a high degree of uncertainty, and therefore, obviously, airlines are trying to prepare for the restart. We cannot comment on commercial practices on the airline, but you can imagine that under the current conditions, and I just mentioned earlier, the expected impact of $76 billion reduction in the revenues of airlines in Europe, and the drop in passenger demand has been. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm hearing noise.
If someone could please mute if you're not speaking, that would be grateful. Please mute your microphones, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Rafael. Let's move on to the second question, which was which European airlines will be hit the most? Small carriers, or ones with only passengers?
Well, this crisis is hitting all airlines to start with. I mean, nobody is expecting. You can imagine. I mean, in any industry, you are not making plans for an industry to stop overnight. To totally stop, right? So you can imagine that is an unprecedented situation. Which ones are average airlines? In average, we estimated that in average airlines would have 2 months cash available, and that is an average. And then obviously that means that there are certain airlines who probably will not have that level of cash available. Now, obviously, larger operations still require larger amount of cash, so it just depends on the balance sheet of each airline. How can they sustain this? But as I said before, in these extraordinary circumstances, we are calling for governments to step in and help the industry with, again, I said direct financial support, as I mentioned, tax relief, and obviously loans and the support by guaranteeing loans, or also supporting the bond, guaranteeing for support on the loan market, on the bond market. So, I mean, these are extraordinary moments. I mean, so the airlines are really in a unique situation, but at the same time, we understand that these are airlines are a catalyst for the world economy. So I would not want to judge which ones are going to be the most hit, but I think all of them are, because everybody is basically locked down and not able to operate.
Thank you. And I think your points there about the cash flow crisis lead well into this next question. Why don't airlines refund tickets but only give vouchers or offer rebooking when it's not sure that travel will pick up that fast? So the issue about vouchers, Rafael.
Yeah, well, if we're talking about this is a liquidity crisis, I mean, the cash flow is running out. Passenger traffic has disappeared. Obviously, we need to keep the airlines operating to a minimum level, even to the point that I highlighted in my message, where we still are seeing a number of flights being run to obviously repatriate individuals, but as well as cargo flights to be bringing much needed medicine. So all of that still requires operations to be run, obviously, and at the same time, I mean, we want to keep those airlines able to restart operations as soon as the crisis is over. So the idea of giving vouchers is obviously because otherwise there will not be enough probably cash to maintain healthy industries still running, because this crisis, what is causing is basically, otherwise, like many healthy businesses will go out of business just because of exceptional crisis. So we want to prevent that. So again, the vouchers are an alternative And anyway, when the crisis is over, I mean, the option will be there or we believe that they should be there to refund. But at this stage, it's an option for passengers to be able to rebook flights into the future.
Thank you. So a question around the aviation industry's future. Every consultant says that aviation will never be the same again after this pandemic. What is our take on this? Is there a need to reform the airlines or the industry?
Well, I think it will probably. That question obviously has a wider impact than aviation. I'm sure it will not be the same for many industries. I think in general, and how governments will assess into the future certain areas like the health systems. Probably in this case, we have to remember that we are a major element in the world economies. I mean, aviation represents $2.7 trillion dollars in GDP to the global economy. 2.7 trillion. About 2.7 million people are directly employed, and 65.5 million are totally are supported by aviation. So what I'm saying is aviation is a big player and a strong element to the global economy. So we don't know exactly what the outcome will be, but obviously we are ready there to support and adapt in necessary ways. I mean, to have a successful again air transport industry after this crisis, and we believe with a strong confidence, obviously, that we will. Now, obviously, to know what exactly will be that form or those changes, we are looking into that as well, I have to say, obviously, how to maintain a healthy and safe and secure airline industry. And certainly we will have lessons to learn from this crisis, but I believe that the industry still will be a strong element, in a strong industry in after the crisis is over.
Thank you. So we spoke earlier about EU 261. Could you explain the changes that we're asking for?
Well, what we are asking is on one side, well, the under these circumstances, and there is a requirement for airlines to refund after 7 days to passengers. And as I said before, considering the situation that we are in today, where business has basically stopped, what we're saying is we should be offering passengers or customers the possibility, the vouchers, so that can help in keeping the addressing the situation today, right, and be able to restart as soon as possible. Obviously, the industry. And the other solution today is it's piling up on a major liquidity crisis, and which no business in the world plans for, right? No business in the world will plan for a total stop of an industry overnight, and this is what has happened due to the COVID-19 virus situation. So we are asking for the option to have vouchers as well included in the process of the EU 261 or the refund to passengers.
Thank you. So a question around the financial aid. Should it be attached to conditions such as restructuring the industry? And this is also linked, I guess, to an earlier question around whether airlines that were already struggling should be propped up by taxpayers' money.
Yeah, well, in this regard, first of all, reminder, we are in an extraordinary crisis, obviously. We remember not too long ago, we had a financial crisis where obviously, taxpayers' money was used to rescue the banks, which were critical, obviously, to the whole, financial recovery or the economic structure of the world. and that was done because of obviously some conditions about financial practices that drove that financial crisis. In this case, the airline industry did run into this crisis, but not it did because of this health, the virus, the pandemic, let's say. So in these extraordinary conditions, I mean, obviously it is not necessarily the best time to assess, which ones should be a coordinated effort by governments, and it should be across the board to the airline industry. Now, obviously, after this crisis is over, we should and could revise, right, any of these, if there are airlines who did embark into different practices that could, maybe be questionable. At this stage, in general, we see that the industry overall needs to be supported by government, supported by other sectors as well. I mentioned in my message that other members of the value chain should be also supporting, because obviously they are dependent on the airline industry. So again, this is probably a moment to get together and try to pull through this crisis and supporting the airlines to be able to restart as soon as possible, because it's going to be one of the strategic elements of their economic recovery.
Okay, thank you. So on the basis of the aid and government help we've seen so far, do you think that some European airlines will actually go under in the coming weeks, or has that been delayed until perhaps the later summer? And if we get some summer season flying, will there in fact be any airlines surviving to do that?
Well, as I said before, we have seen some good initiatives by certain governments, and we thank them for that. But we also said that worldwide, we estimate that there is a need for the industry for $200 billion dollars in support, right? So we are still short of that, meaning the good initiatives are still not enough. Even though we congratulate, obviously, the ones that have taken the lead on this, we still believe that there is more needed, because obviously this is an unprecedented situation where I just mentioned before, $252 billion less revenue in the current year, 76 billion of that reduction in the European case, being one of the largest, by the way, in the world, and actually the highest in terms of RPK reduction with a 46%. So it is unprecedented, and we believe that there is much more needed in terms of government aid, but also, there are other. We also need some help in terms of other parts of the industry as well, facilitating this. The ANSPs, for example, the charges, etc., because obviously that affects the cash flow of the whole industry as well.
Thank you. And just to a further question, so yes, as Rafael mentioned there, we have put a general global figure on approximately 200 billion in aid, but we don't have a breakdown for Europe specifically. Moving on to another question on commercial airline pilots. What are the present restrictions on commercial airline pilots serving cargo-only passenger aircraft flights? And what are you asking regulators to adjust?
Well, we have seen. We have seen inconsistencies, and we have been working closely with authorities. We have helped. We have had many, obviously, supporting, but we still have seen inconsistencies on, as I mentioned before, on regulation, or for example, on crews either not being allowed, overflights not being allowed, certain slots, for example, or even allowing flights to be happening at maybe times where flight might be in regular times might be restricted. So we are seeing different restrictions in different places. Having said that, I mean, the cargo support that is being done around the world is extraordinary. Today we're seeing lots of flights coming and going to, for example, Asia, as we heard many times already. China is obviously sending support as well as other nations. So we do see a very strong, I would say, cargo movement, and that's why we still need certain regulations in certain places. And I don't have the specifics on each case, but overall, there are cases where we are seeing that we need more flexibilities, or again reductions on maybe on fees as well to make them as well viable. So in general, there are some places where this is needed, not everywhere, because the business is still going and moving, and in general supported.
Okay, thank you. Next question: what impact is the current situation, or could current situation have on consolidation in Europe? Is this a good time for mergers and acquisitions, like Polish Aviation Group buying Condor Airlines?
Well, first of all, the purchase of Condor, for example, was obviously prior to the crisis, and that's a commercial decision that any airline can any industry or corporation can make. In terms of, is it a good time for consolidation? I mean, this is. We will see. We have said that obviously Europe it's a very fragmented market in the past. We are certain under the current conditions that it will be difficult for many airlines to survive, obviously, and some of them. We are not talking about the airlines that are in or were in a fragile situation before the crisis. We're also talking about airlines that are becoming fragile because of the crisis, and they were healthy businesses before the crisis. So it's a very unique moment in the sense that, yeah, it could be that there might be some consolidations immediately after because of the crisis, but we don't have a figure or an analysis done on that at this stage. We are all focusing on trying to support the industry and obviously support the efforts by governments to contain the virus on one side and obviously reactivate the economies on the other, right?
Thank you. Next question. OAG says that the rebound in traffic and capacity will take longer than it took in the past, as the growth impact and capacity in the last couple of years was not sustainable. What is IATA's take on this?
Well, we do believe in our latest estimate, what you heard from us already. We expect severe travel restrictions, to be lifted only after 3 months. Right? That's the estimate we did, and obviously we still expect a slower recovery because demand will be weakened by the impact of a global recession, which is what we're seeing now. So we believe that is the case why we see a slower recovery. Again, our first estimates were not even close to the numbers we're seeing now, because it is unprecedented. It's the worst crisis that this industry has seen, in the last, at least 30 years or 40 years. So it is unprecedented, and we do expect to have a slower recovery. Yes, so I guess in that sense we tend to agree. Now, if it's because of previous practices, I think this is not necessarily the case. I mean, this is a crisis that was not brought in by the industry; it was brought by a pandemic.
Yes, thank you, Rafael. Yes, and indeed, from the profitability point of view, the industry was returning the cost of capital in recent years, so that would seem to indicate that the industry was operating sustainably, at least on a financial basis. Moving on, another question. What's your geographical breakdown for the revenue hit? Is Europe now seen as likely to be the worst affected even than Asia? Just before I pass to Rafael on that, I should say that we will be releasing a press release early this afternoon that will contain a breakdown of some of the specific impacts on key markets in Europe. So that will have more detail. Please keep an eye on your inboxes for that. But in general, Rafael, your thoughts on, is Europe even more affected than other regions?
Well, definitely Europe will be at the center, at the epicenter now of the virus spreading, or the pandemic. We will be one of the hardest hit, as I said, 76 billion. We do expect to be as well. We do expect a very large hit in Asia Pacific as well. Those numbers right now, they look around 88 billion. But definitely between Europe and Asia Pacific are the much, in our estimates, we will be the hardest hit overall worldwide. In terms of, as I said, in terms of RPKs, we do expect Europe to be the hardest hit worldwide with a 46% reduction.
Thank you. There was another question on 261. What's the most problematic point? I think we've covered that quite a lot. It's the voucher issue that Rafael talked about in more detail. Moving on, do you know how many flights are being currently cancelled or suspended in Europe per day? And do we have figures on that? Well, we'll come back with more detailed figures on that, but at the top level, I believe Rafael mentioned it's around 80%. In terms of capacity decline since in comparison to the same time last year. Is that your understanding, Rafael?
Well, yeah. I mean, yes, definitely, it's over 80% by now. I mean, if you look at what happened yesterday in Europe, we have less than 6,000 flights, about 5,800 flights yesterday in Europe, compared to an average of 30,000 flights a day. So. That can give you a bit of the magnitude, and some of the largest carriers in Europe are, in some cases, like the largest group like Lufthansa or IAG or Air France or EasyJet or Ryanair. They're all more close to the 90% over reduction than less than 90%. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the number of flights that are being reduce or so. It's almost a standstill of the industry by now.
Thank you. There's a question around the ghost flights. We don't have figures for the number that were operated at the early part of the crisis, but perhaps, Rafael, you could explain why there were some so-called ghost flights and what that obviously the reason why we called for that urgent reform to the slot regulation and the slot use rules.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, this is why I express my appreciation and our appreciation as an industry for the European Commission, obviously, to grant an exception on the 80-20 rule, which is the rule says that flights need to be operated 80% of the time at least on that slot to keep the slot. Otherwise, the airlines are bound to lose it. And in extreme situation like this, where countries are locking down airlines, where obviously even while they were being reduced or limited, they were keeping flights to not losing those slots. So in the beginning, when the resolution or the regulation was not modified temporarily due to the exception that we are living, then flights were being kept for the sake of keeping those slots, which are very valuable to when they will restart the business again and when they will be able to put flights again. Then they need to have that predictability that they can operate those flights. So it was an unusual situation that happened, but now in the case of Europe, of the EU, that regulation has been modified. So and we are encouraging, obviously, governments around the world to do the same. Obviously, Europe as well, I have to mention it's one of the most complicated cases because we have the greatest number of slot-regulated greater airports in the world. So obviously that was a major, a critical element on the reason why we have seen many of these ghost flights in the past. I think this is not necessarily anymore the case in Europe because of the regulation being modified.
Thank you. We have a question about share buybacks. What about the immense share buyback programs of the airlines in the past? This liquidity would be needed now.
Yeah, well, share buybacks, this is a practice by businesses in all sectors, right? So, and it also includes a limited number of airlines, and obviously this is another way of delivering dividends to investors. Now, in general, investors around the world, be it pension funds, individuals, employees, I mean, they put their money on certain companies to gain a return, and obviously not to see a stockpile of cash in the company, right? If there is a concern about this practice, there should be a discussion, I guess, that leads to a conclusion that will look into all businesses, not just airlines, right? But I guess it also will be responsible to delay the critical aid that we're talking about for a discussion of this type, right? Today we're talking about extraordinary times, and in normal times, yes, I would say yes, this discussion can or should happen. But today we're talking about extraordinary times when all this was not in the plan, in the books of anybody, and obviously, our airlines don't necessarily, as I said before, like any other business, prepare for a total shutdown of business suddenly.
Thank you. Question about airports. London City Airport in the UK suspended flights last night. A couple of smaller airports have done the same. Do you expect to see more European airports?
If I expect to see more airports, sorry, can you?
Sorry, yes, we have some noise on the line, so someone please mute their microphone. Thank you. Do you expect to see more European airports temporarily closed down completely in the coming weeks?
Well, we have seen already regional airports. Many of them already closed down. I mean, we have seen that. In terms of the major airports, we have also seen, major hubs either totally or partially shutting down certain terminals. So everybody is trying to adjust to these situations. As I said before, air transport is a catalyst in the economic world, and it's impacting airports. By not being able to fly, obviously airports are heavily impacted. They are trying to cope with the situation. They are restructuring in some cases to be able to cope with this crisis. We have seen reductions in the way it's being operated at Heathrow as well. We have seen reductions at CDG or Orly. We have seen reductions in here in Madrid as well, where the expectations is the government is trying to push, for example, the great majority of operations only to Terminal 4. So again, we're going to see either smaller operations, maybe or airports closing them, but the large ones actually having to reduce operations to a minimum to be able to cope with the minimum necessary, but as well as preserving, as well as they can, the economic, the economic situation, right?
Thank you. So a follow-up question on the voucher discussion that we had with EU261. Doesn't this proposal amount to forcing individual customers to inject cash into the airlines? Is it acceptable to offload financial risk onto those consumers who happen to have booked an affected flight? Could this affect the industry's reputation?
Well, I mean, there are already in many countries, places. First of all, I already highlighted that, for example, for tour packages, this was already an option, right? Now, this is again, we're asking for this on an extraordinary time condition. We are not necessarily actually requesting this as this is an option, but today we're living an extraordinary moment. And the situation is that suddenly, the business disappeared. Now, if all of these, individuals will be able to, in the future, be able to use those vouchers to fly, and probably also use those vouchers as well to collect when the airlines are again in business. But today, the airlines are not able to fly. They are not able to generate cash.
Okay, thank you. What is IATA's view on the rapidly expanding number of flight bans by governments? The World Health Organization believes they're futile.
Well, I mean, the World Health Organization has not necessarily, mandated to stop flights. We believe flying is still safe. I mean, where airlines, aircrafts are quite actually healthy environment. The proximity to other people is what obviously increases the chances of getting the virus. But then obviously people who are sick should be taking the necessary precautions, and all of us follow the recommendations of the international health authorities in terms of either washing hands or not getting close to each other in certain distances. But aircrafts are quite healthy environments actually. We have the HEPA filters are equipped with HEPA filters, which are actually they capture greater than 99.97% of airborne microbes. These are the same filters that are used, for example, in hospitals' operating room, and the air in an aircraft is changed, per hour about 20 to 30 times. So it's quite a healthy environment, I would say. So air travel is still safe, and airlines as well are taking extreme precautions to manage, obviously, the situation, and they have all procedures to follow in that sense. And at the same time, we know that the airlines have implemented extra measures to in terms of disinfecting the extra frequently disinfecting aircraft more frequently. So the cleaning routines have obviously been upgraded, and they are obviously stepping these up compared to normal times. So I believe it's still safe to travel, but obviously we have to follow the recommendations considering the pandemic conditions that we're in.
And a related question I've received made the point that potentially aviation is part of the problem because obviously infected people were transported by air. Do we have any plans already to address that issue once coronavirus is under control?
Well, the airline is, it's a good question actually, because it's a big part of the discussion going on right now. I mean, what are the measures and the plans in place when the industry will restart? Because by now, as we have been speaking already, the industry is such a low level of operation. Very, most of the countries are on lockdown, so the reduced operation is already having an impact. Now, it is a part of the discussion on restarting and what are the measures to be taken. But as I said before, we are working on it. So I can say yes, that we're working on it. At the same time, and with authorities as well, because there is a very regulatory component to it. At the same time, I insist. I mean, there are certain procedures that probably will be put in place, but I can say that what I mentioned before is still an important thing to reflect, which the air supply in the modern jet aircraft is actually close to sterile. So we have to take all the measures to complement that. But it's important to and we will, but it's important to understand that flying is not necessarily bad. Obviously, again, I'm saying that knowing that we need to maintain a relatively level of isolation now to be able to contain the virus.
Thank you. Just a few more questions left. One from Christiane asking if any crew or passengers have been infected in the line of duty, which I take to mean whilst on board. Are we aware of any infections that have occurred whilst on board?
Well, the level of we believe that the level of the information we have so far is that the level of infect or being contaminated or being infected while on board is extremely low. Again, we can get contaminated by going into going to the airport or going through the public transport system or taking a taxi ride or so there are many areas where we can be contaminated. That's difficult to assess, but as I said before, the level of precaution and the level of let's say clean of environment being an aircraft is not necessarily it is. We have not seen clear signs that this is the case. Obviously, we do have, as in every sector of the society, we do have people who have been infected, but not necessarily related to being on an aircraft. And at the same time, if that happens, if there is a person that was found to be infected and has come into an aircraft, well, immediately actions are taken to advise, advise to the people that were involved in that flight for precautionary measures to be able to take quarantine or precautionary actions, right?
Thank you. What impact would a delayed recovery in the US due to a more severe spread of the pandemic there have on EU airlines' ability to recover?
In the US, you said, Chris, it was a bit...
Sorry, yes, I would be... what impact would a delayed recovery in the US have on EU airlines' ability to recover?
Well, I mean, you will have, I think, an important impact because obviously the EU and the EU and the US is one of the biggest trading sectors in the world. The North Atlantic is one of the busiest and biggest, travel market in the world. So obviously, will have a huge impact in terms of the airline industry, but not only that will not be limited to the airline industry. Will be very much linked to the economy as a whole, right?
Yeah, and I think obviously our economics team are updating these numbers every week or two. We'll be keeping an eye on that, and if the situation were to change in the US, then obviously that would be reflected in our projections going forward. A couple of final questions. One I'd received was asking about the idea of nationalisation or taking direct stakes, governments taking direct stakes in airlines as a result of the financial aid requirements. Do we have a view on that?
Well, I think in that we don't have a particular view. I mean, we think the industry needs to be. There are different ways to. There are different options in terms of airline ownership, and there are certain places where we see national airlines. We have and different types of ownerships. We don't necessarily recommend any of them. There are different options, so we are not necessarily any. We believe that governments can provide aid to the industry without nationalizing the carriers, right? We already stated those. I think I mentioned already that before, and that's what we should be focusing on.
One final question. When we say Europe, do we mean EU plus? That is correct. The figures that we quoted earlier are for the whole of the Europe and Eurasia area, which is IATA's definition for Europe. So that indeed includes Russia and other states. I don't believe we have any further messages or questions. Oh, sorry, we do have another one. So British Airlines and airports have been told by the government they will not receive an industry-wide bailout, despite an initial pledge of support from the Chancellor last week. What's IATA's take on that?
Well, yes, they have stated that, and they obviously have provided some relief or alleviation to industries in general that will be, beneficial to airlines as well. But they also understood they opened the possibility of bilateral discussions specifically to each airlines if they need to. Again, we're saying that as a whole, we do believe these are extraordinary moments. I mean, the level of we have not seen a crisis like this before. So we do believe that it is a moment for governments to support. Maybe that would be an initial statement from the UK governments, but this is an evolving crisis, and we believe it's going to impact economically nations and not just the airlines itself.
Thank you. And one final question. Airlines may be forced to lay off employees if they don't get the funding. Support packages take this into consideration. So I think should support packages be linked to employment or retaining employment?
Yes, definitely should. And in some cases we have seen that. I mean, we have seen some important where initiatives which is also, not just related to industry, but in some cases very specific to the airline industry, where government is willing to support, for example, some of the cost of the of that unemployment, for example, in a temporary basis, some of the fixed costs of the airlines in some cases. I mean, we have seen some cases in Denmark, in Sweden, partially in the UK. So we have seen some initiatives in terms of supporting either temporary unemployment or supporting, in a way, the industry to take care of and make sure that we, the unemployed. I mean, we don't have to either cause that much damage in terms of employment. But yeah, that's still we believe is still. The key is to support these airlines financially, as I said before, so they can actually restart the business as soon as possible and therefore minimizing the impact on jobs.
Okay, well, that's all the questions we have. So a huge thank you to Rafael for your time today. A reminder to everyone that we will be issuing a press release later today, which will have some further information, including a breakdown of some of the impacts on various European countries. Thank you all for joining us, and we appreciate your time. Have a great day, and everyone, please stay healthy. Thank you.